This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is February 6th, 2020, and this is episode 175.
I'm Stark Lennebaum.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, ICBC is moving to no-fault insurance. Sorry, that's a care-based model. And Peter MacKay is okay with yoga, it turns out. First, let's thank those who helped make this show possible. Our newest patron is Alex. That's awesome. I think we did lose a couple at the end of the month with the turnover and credit cards expiring, and that's not great, so we're at 82 this point in time. Patrons, if you can spare a couple dollars, help make this show continue on. We got lots of stuff coming up in the new year, and hey, maybe there'll be an early election like a majority of British Columbians apparently want. Politicos, go to patreon.com/Politicos. Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. And a second to last reminder that on February 15th, we'll be at Fan Expo at 5:15 p.m. We're going to be joined by the co-hosts of the Pop This podcast, who are feminists who like to talk about pop culture. So we're going to talk about the politics of pop culture. And we'll figure out some franchises that have interesting politics and what we can learn about the world through that. Or even just dissect whether individual characters make good political choices or bad. Most of them make bad choices, it turns out. We will release a normal episode next week. At least that's the plan. And then we'll drop that live show as something in the feed the following week, because I think I have a bunch of tickets to Just for Laughs Northwest. So I'll be going and watching comedy instead of talking about politics. Let's jump into our BC Poly Roundup with the latest in politics news. First up, there's a new poll out showing nothing has changed since the election.
Yeah, so the polling by Maple Leaf Strategies, which was commissioned by the BC Liberal Party, has the NDP at 33, the Liberals at 33, and the Greens at 17%. And overall just paints a picture of a pretty static political environment, which, like you said, has been more or less the case since the election.
Now, the caveats right off the top there. I don't know much about Maple Leaf Strategies as a pollster. I think I've seen 1 or 2 polls from them before, so I don't know if they're particularly good. They are run by a guy who's connected to the BC Liberals and federal Conservatives in the past, Dimitri Parasitovis. I don't know exactly how to pronounce his last name. And this was a poll released by the BC Liberals, which means they think it's good for them. Because if it was bad for them, they just wouldn't release it.
Which maybe isn't the greatest sign that the party's really ready to fight an election if their, big pitches were tied.
I mean, the dominant feeling out there, I think, at least my gut instinct would be they're slightly back and they're hamstrung a little bit by a leader who's not performing as well.
Yeah, so that's been kind of one of the constants, is that while the party level polling has been more or less the same, with the two parties in pretty close position, in terms of approval ratings for the leaders, Horgan's been doing better than Andrew Wilkinson has.
There's a number of other questions asked in this poll. I think the Liberals are fond of the numbers around how the government's performing, where a lot of people are still frustrated with housing prices, ICBC rates, which we'll get to, and other elements. But we'll see. It takes until an election to see if this holds up.
Yeah, the one thing I was a little surprised about in this was that they're tied in the Lower Mainland, and kind of my perception out there, which might just be the fact that I live in, kind of the central part of the Vancouver more than some of the suburbs, is that the Liberals weren't quite doing as well as the NDP were in Metro Vancouver.
The election came down to the suburbs, like in central Vancouver or City of Vancouver, Burnaby, New West, this little area went pretty orange with a couple exceptions.
Well, yeah, we're sitting in, I think, Vancouver East right now.
one of the orangest ridings in the province.
Yeah, an incredibly orange area. But overall, City of Vancouver, it's split fairly evenly. You have Wilkinson, Lee, and Sullivan, all from the Liberals, representing
The
City of
wealthier
Vancouver ridings.
And so there are Liberals in the Lower Mainland. The island, though, is where we saw a lot of three-way races, and it's a close race there with the NDP 10 points ahead of, it sounds like, both the Liberals and the Greens, who are tied around 23%. So lots of battlegrounds. The Liberals are, of course, running away with the Interior and the North. But the other interesting poll out this week was from Research Co., who was just asking, do you expect to see an early election, and do you want one? And unsurprisingly, most BC Liberal voters and people in the North and Interior want an early election, but even just across the board, it was majorities or pluralities wanted an election.
Which kind of surprised me.
Except among the oldest demographic. I think they were the only ones who were jaded about elections in general. But
The demographic that's most likely to show up to vote?
And vote Liberal. So there's some weird correlations there. But apparently people want an election. This is one of the times I'm happy to have a year off of elections because there's so much suctioning of politics out of the US right now. It's exhausting, as anyone who's been following Iowa, which we will not be talking about. The other interesting number in the Research Co. poll was not who was leading in the horse race, but just would you consider voting for any of these parties? And it kind of measures accessible voters. What's the maximum they could do? And the NDP actually won that with 60% of people saying they'd vote NDP, 54% Liberal, and only 45%, which is still a pretty solid number. If you got 45% of the vote, you have a majority government in BC, would vote Green.
Well, not if the other one got
55?
Yeah.
We have 3 functioning parties. They also asked about BC Conservatives, but I'm not going to give them the credit. Oof. Exactly.
So yeah, putting these two polls together, it paints an interesting picture. Because like you, I was a little surprised that most British Columbians were hankering for an election. But looking at where the parties are relative to each other, it's not particularly clear what's going to change out of it. And, picking up one seat by pretty much either party, I guess 2 technically since Plekis no longer a Liberal, but picking up 1 or 2 seats by either party can really change things. So I can kind of see the point there, but at the same time, there's a decent chance we just kind of end up with a pretty tied situation. But one thing that will help parties fight the next election is money. And this week, the quarterly financial reports came out for last quarter 2019. So we now know where the parties stand. The NDP raised $1.3 million for a total of $3.7 over the course of the year. Liberals pulled in a little less than that at $828,000 for a $2.9 million yearly haul, and the Greens brought in $207,000 for about $650,000 overall.
Yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff in here. So we've talked on the show before, I believe, and have posted a piece on the website about roughly where the parties were probably sitting at the end of 2018 based on their balance sheets. And as far as we could tell, the Liberals were in a bad state, possibly in debt, versus the NDP had cash in the bank. And given that the NDP has raised $800,000 more than the Liberals in the last year, that's more cash in the bank to fight an election, whereas the Liberals are sort of still paying off bills from the previous races. Added to that is the number of donors came out, and the NDP had over 10,000 donors to the Liberals 5,000, so twice as many people giving. NDP got more smaller donations, but that can make a huge difference when people who give you money are probably going to vote for you. So just having that base be more generous is helpful for the NDP. Not good numbers for the Greens, though. They're actually, the other 2 main parties, or the 2 biggest parties, posted bigger fundraising gains in 2019 than they did in 2018, about $500,000. The Greens raised less money in 2019 than 2018, $60,000 less, which
isn't great, especially when a lot of the donor base in this coming year is going to be putting money towards leadership races rather than the party.
The party will take a chunk of that, as is always the case. And I think the Greens are hoping, which we'll get into when we talk about the leadership race later, that maybe this supporter regime they're bringing in will bring additional supporters in who might become financial supporters at some point. But it's really hard to fight, a province-wide election. So they're going to continue to be focused on Vancouver Island, maybe a spot or two to try to break into the Lower Mainland. But it's not shaping up to be a Green breakthrough unless they find, some pots of gold.
Yeah, the Greens' best bet is to try and hold the 3 seats, and Weaver's soon-to-be former seat is one that they're by no means are sure to hold, and then maybe pick up 1 or 2 others. But yeah, with the resource limitations that their lower fundraising numbers and just smaller party infrastructure has, it's going to be tough for them to gain. And yeah, the Liberals are slowly fixing their financial situation, but yeah, they're not quite as ready as they could be for an election. And well, with the NDP, political money often follows success. So, it's not a surprise to see a governing party post pretty healthy fundraising results.
I mean, it's also helpful for the NDP that the rules they brought in work better for small donations like they've been getting. And the Liberals have not been able to just knock on a number of major companies and other firms and get big checks. But money's not the only thing in politics that matters. You do need to keep your base happy. In one area, the NDP is struggling a bit as they try to negotiate the ongoing Wet'suwet'en standoff in northern BC that we've talked about for the last few weeks. Last week, we talked about how Nathan Cullen had been appointed as a sort of mediator to try to cool down the tensions between the hereditary chiefs and Coastal GasLink and the government. And it was also announced that Scott Fraser, the Indigenous Relations Minister, would be going in to try to meet with them over a week to find some solution. That dialogue lasted 2 days, and then they kind of broke it off amicably, I guess, with no resolution.
A little hard to see how amicably it can be.
I mean, the statements were positive. Like, we tried. We're still friends. We just don't want to talk to each other anymore because it's pointless.
Not still not a great sign.
The other thing that's happening is just in the last day or two, the RCMP have moved in to enforce the injunction and have been arresting people at the anti-pipeline camp. There's been a number of notes. The BCCLA has written an open letter to the RCMP. Apparently the RCMP have enforced a hard injunction, including no journalists, which has been criticized by civil liberties groups and the courts before as kind of stepping on press freedom, because usually you give a little pass to members of the media to let us know what's happening there. That would seem a reasonable thing, even if there is an injunction. So definitely keep your eyes on what's happening up there. I think Ricochet's been doing a lot of work to cover that on the ground, so props to them.
And finally, BC looks like it may be without an innovation commissioner going forward, as the term expired for Dr. Alan Winter, who finished up his 2 years in the position this week. And while the government had some nice stuff to say about him, they didn't really seem all that keen on moving forward with the new innovation commissioner.
So this is a really weird story. Originally, the innovation commissioner was something the Green Party was really pushing for in the election, and it was part of the confidence and supply agreement, and the NDP agreed to it. And the idea was to hire a czar who would make innovation happen, bring innovative jobs, negotiate with business, talk to other levels of government, and just be a voice advocating for innovation.
Yeah, the problem with that is very few people have heard government commissioner and immediately thought, wow, that's an innovative position. And I think we talked about this at the time. It's been far from clear exactly what an innovation commissioner is supposed to do at a nuts and bolts level to make stuff more innovative.
Yeah, I think I said this to someone else in a DM that innovation commissioner is such a peak Green Party idea of well, we need to create this thing. Why? Because jobs, green jobs, innovative jobs. And it's yes, but what does he do? And now the question is kind of, what has he done? And I guess that's what the government's going to be reviewing before they decide whether to hire his replacement. Because usually when someone retires, there's a clear path to finding a new one, especially when it's a fixed term and he'll be retiring.
Yeah, just in general, there isn't a great amount of knowledge out there about what actually makes stuff innovative. like there's, ideas about, or, people know what correlates with it somewhat, and there's, some academic work on it. But like if you were to try and put together a comprehensive policy to foster innovation, it's far from clear what that's going to be like. And the number of, failed attempts to make it, quote unquote, the net Silicon Valley in who knows how many places should make people a little skeptical of the ability of a government commissioner to bring about innovation.
I mean, maybe we're both wrong. Maybe we will find out that Dr. Winter has done a ton of amazing stuff, and
so
BC
much
is now...
He's innovated so much, the position isn't needed anymore.
Fair.
So that closed out our BC politics roundup. We know this for a couple weeks now, and kind of curious what the listeners think. So if you like us front-loading the BC politics stuff, let us know. If you like the old format, also let us know.
We're on Twitter at PoliticoastPod. We're on Facebook at Politicoast, Instagram at Politicoast, or tell us in our Patreon Slack, or email us podcast@politicoast.ca. Let's jump into the main segment then on ICBC through no fault of their own. The big news this morning was the government has flip-flopped, actually. They've gone from saying we'll never have no-fault insurance in BC to we'll have an enhanced care-based coverage for everyone that is called no-fault in other provinces.
Some grade A spin on that one.
I think I heard someone say, like, no-fault wasn't really clear what it was, and people who are at fault will still face penalties, so it's not really no fault. And at the same time, care-based insurance wasn't clear to me until I'd read through everything, what they were trying to get at with that. So maybe there's just no branding, because insurance is always kind of complicated.
Yeah, it is, but let's try and break it down. What is being brought in?
I think the simplest way to understand it is they're basically just going to destroy the Trial Lawyers Association of BC. They're changing it from an adversarial system where to get compensation after a crash or an accident, you have to sue everyone, to ICBC just decides what you get and covers your injuries. The way they're making this happen is by just increasing the amount of money available. So right now there's caps on what you can be paid out, and instead they'll be much higher. So rather than having a $300,000 limit on what you get paid out for your injury, it'll go up to $7.5 million. And the idea is to try to really support people who've been injured, especially in serious ways that's sometimes life-affecting. And rather than just give you a one-time check, continue to pay those medical costs until you're recovered and back to full. And that also includes not just medical costs, but additional funding to go to replacing your wage if you have to miss work, and creating a bunch of new benefits, including caregiver benefits if someone needs to take time off work to support you. There's even a recreation bonus in there where if you're so permanently disabled, you need assistance to get out of the house and have fun. Every 2 years, you'll get up to $4,000 to have an aide come with you to the theater, they say. So there's a lot in here that looks appealing. And I think that's to try to get past I won't have a lawyer on my side defending me. And the reason is because the lawyers have been making this very expensive.
Yeah, so right now there's an estimate about $1.5 billion in legal fees, which shocked me. I expected a large number, but something with $1 million at the end of it.
So getting rid of that helps.
Yeah, you can see why the government's wanted to bring it in, because it is a huge financial cost, especially in situations where ICBC is effectively paying both sides legal fees.
And I think that's where people have been really frustrated by ICBC as well, because it's whose side are you really on? Because they are really on three sides. They want to reduce costs overall, and they also have to represent the person who's at fault and the person who's not at fault, or both sides in a collision. And it messes it all up. So in this new regime, they're not really representing anyone. They're just trying to get everyone back to healthy. And if you're the at-fault party, your premiums go up. So you do face a penalty. But you won't be sued. And that saves court costs. A lot of court costs.
Yeah, so that's the positive side on this, but it isn't without its controversies. And it's not just the trial lawyers. I've talked to people who I know that have been in auto accidents and who really felt like having a lawyer on their side fighting for them was the thing that got them the compensation they deserved. And there's going to be a real worry from a lot of people that's not unreasonable that without a lawyer in your corner, really fighting for you, without the ability to sue over this stuff, there are some rules around if someone was drunk or driving illegally.
If they get convicted under the criminal code, then you can sue. But
like just in a dispute with ICBC over insurance payouts.
Yeah, so that's the biggest question is, what do you do if you think ICBC's still trying to screw you? Because obviously they'll still have an incentive to reduce costs. Like, the incentive for ICBC is not to throw money at everyone, right? It's to keep costs under control, even under this new situation. So that's where there's kind of a multi-step appeals process. That's where the Fairness Office we talked about last week comes in. So you go complain to the Fairness Commissioner of ICBC. And if you don't like what they've had to say, you go to the BC Ombudsperson. And if they're still not helpful, then you can go to the Civil Resolution Tribunal. And this is the adjudicative body that the government set up to effectively replace small claims court and handle minor disputes. The idea with that is it can all be done online, and it can all be done without a lawyer if you choose. And if you don't like the result of the Civil Resolution Tribunal, you can appeal that for judicial review to the BC Supreme Court, and that's when you can get lots of lawyers involved if that's your fancy. So it puts the lawyers like 8 steps away.
Yeah, but it's easy to kind of say you have a fairness commissioner and you have ombuds people and a civil resolution tribunal, but the details on how that works is really going to matter, and there's going to be a lot of skepticism about whether or not those systems will actually work and be able to be as effective as having a lawyer suing on your behalf.
Well, one of the ways they want to beat that skepticism is by just throwing money at the things. So that $1.5 billion that they're going to save in legal fees, they're just basically going to turn around and use it to cut premiums. So premiums will be frozen this year, and then when this system comes in, they're estimating effectively an across-the-board 20% cut in premiums, which will work out to $400 a year for the average driver, which is not nothing.
Yeah. Well, it kind of depends how much your premiums went up this year. I actually just did my insurance on the weekend and got hit with a $300 increase, which can't say I'm super happy about. And that's only because they no longer have the 10-year driving discount in there. It got swapped around a bit, and if you're between 10 and 15, you don't get as big a discount anymore, which kind of sucks. But there are a lot of people who are paying more, and there's a reason that ICBC costs have been one of the things that gets named quite a bit when it comes to dissatisfaction with the current government.
Yeah, so I think it's worth kind of tracing the path of how we got to this, because the BC NDP had been very explicitly clear that they were saying no to no-fault insurance. The trial lawyers BC include in their press release a letter from Adrian Dix, who says no to no-fault. David Eby had been on the record multiple times. John Horgan, I'm pretty sure, had also been on the record of saying no to no-fault. So why the flip-flop? Rob Shaw's got a great piece in the Vancouver Sun where he clearly had a long time to interview David Eby on just how we got here. A good exclusive, we'll throw the link in. Let's walk through it. So David Eby comes from a law background. He was a practicing lawyer. He litigated for the BC Civil Liberties Association. He was executive director there, and then he moved into government. So he's got a lot of friends in the law community, and so he knows the value of having a lawyer on your side, and he likes that, and that's what he says is what led him to not want to do no fault in the first place. But he talks about how, as he got into this file and realized, level upon level of how bad of a situation ICBC was in, that it was going to take a lot. So in the first couple of years, 2017, 2018, he started doing a lot of work, and there were a lot of reforms that we've talked about before. And those reforms are actually working. They were helping. Unfortunately, they only went so far. And some of the reforms he put in, like trying to cap the number of expert witnesses that could be called at trial, were defeated by the trial lawyers in court and in challenges. And that really frustrated the situation. And at one point, he actually, put out there as a statement to the trial lawyers, if you keep fighting this so hard, you're not going to like where we end up, as almost a foreshadowing of where we ended up. And so he starts talking in there about how, starting in late 2018, started having conversations internally. Through 2019, he ended up meeting with the CEOs of the public auto insurance companies in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, who
Suppose
both
they're deputy ministers and senior government people.
And Saskatchewan and Manitoba are interesting because both offer no-fault options and have models that were used to design this new BC model. And what he notes is that those two provinces have had flat insurance rates for the last 5 years. Manitoba's even looking at lowering their insurance premiums next year because they managed to keep costs under control. And that becomes really appealing even when you pull out all the reforms you can within the current system and people are still facing rate hikes like you, Scott. And just with all those different challenges, he kind of came begrudgingly, he paints it, to the decision that this is where we'll have to go. And so it sounds like they were finalizing the idea last year. It went to the cabinet table in December, and he actually lobbied for this. And here we are. So it just took that long time. And he also talks about looking at what the BC Liberals are calling for is bring private insurance in. And as best as I think they had Ernst & Young do some analyses on what it would cost, what they found is if they brought private insurance into the market the way it's being called for, young drivers in particular would be hit with a 30% rate hike. So there wasn't a way in his mind to maintain what's called intergenerational equity, as in don't screw the kids to keep who are more dangerous drivers to help, grandma and grandpa. And it seemed like the only way out was this model. And that's how we got here. And now he's tasked with pitching it and selling it to people, part of which is probably this long-form article explaining exactly how we got here.
Mm-hmm. So it's going to go forward. The Greens have already said they'll be supporting that. The Liberals have come out in opposition to this.
Oh, the Liberals are apoplectic.
Yeah.
Because if this works, the Liberals don't have their strongest pitch, which was auto insurance is broken, we're going to try something new. Something new is being tried. Mm-hmm. It'll take a few years to come in, and to prove itself.
Yeah, so I expect they'll be going pretty hard on the stuff we talked about earlier about trust in ICBC and whether or not people are comfortable giving up a lawyer and the ability to sue.
And the other half of it you have to remember is that personal injury lawyers are the worst lawyers. People don't generally have a great opinion of lawyers. Most people. We happen to know a number of lawyers who are really nice people. Some of our best friends are lawyers. But there's a reason the term ambulance chaser exists as a skeevy kind of interject. And those lawyers are sometimes taking 20 to 30% of the settlements. One of the things David Eby actually highlights in his article is or in this article with Rob Shaw, is a number of individual cases is what brought him around.
Yeah, there's one that an $127,000 settlement ended up having a payout of $22,000 after legal fees.
Yeah, and it was probably not a common occurrence, but
it might not be representative, but
it's impactful.
It's an edge case that should be considered.
And so, on the one hand, lawyers can definitely be very helpful in these situations and can be your best backup. But on the other hand, if I come out of an injury in a car crash, I don't want to have to be thinking about lawsuits and courts. I just want some money to get better. Actually, I just want to get better. I don't even care about the money. Fix my car, fix me.
Yeah. Nevertheless, though, one of the consistent findings of behavioral economics, I think psychology in general, is that people value the thing they have right now more than kind of its equivalent value for something they'd receive. It's people put a big premium on something they have right now that they're potentially losing. And that, in a situation like this, I could see being quite powerful in making this at least politically costly to go ahead with. And there will probably be a knockdown, drag-out fight, at least in the public argument over this.
Yeah.
Before the trial lawyers get really involved in it, which they no doubt will, that there'll be a big push from, I think, a lot of people on this, including the Liberals.
The question will be, are people so fed up with the rates they're paying that $400 back in your pocket becomes I want that, and this pain I'm having in my wallet is a bigger pain than the theoretical crash that I might have to deal with, and then get screwed. Because realistically, most people don't get in car crashes all the time. Most. Mm-hmm. Enough do that we all have had to deal with auto insurance at some point. But I think one analogy that's helpful historically to think about this transition is actually about 100 years old. And it's one that's actually a really neat story that I want to tell about British Columbia. It's the history of WorkSafe BC. Do you know the story of WorkSafe BC, Scott?
I do not.
So in the early days of British Columbia, mines weren't that safe, as you can imagine. There were a lot of accidents and workplace deaths. There still were after WorkSafe BC came around, or the Workers' Compensation Board.
Although, currently, right now, they have a very intense safety culture that has really changed.
And so initially in British Columbia, it was entirely a tort regime, just like auto insurance is now. And so if you got injured at work, your recourse was to sue your employer for damages. And you'd argue back and forth. The employer might say, oh, well, you are actually a bit negligent in how you were performing your duties, just as no employer would admit to their lax safety standards around their work site. But it would be a back and forth of, who's at fault for this injury? Was it the employer or was it the employee who got injured? And eventually this became similarly unsustainable, as employees often didn't have the resources to fight employers, and it got costly. So the province intervened and basically said, all right, well, we'll settle with this compromise. No one can sue anyone anymore, and we'll create an agency, which became WorkSafe BC later, and it will just pay out injuries, and it will be paid in by the employers. And it was effectively kind of a no-fault situation on workplace safety. Now, WorkSafe BC also became responsible for promoting workplace safety and ensuring standards were met, and it kind of took some of the onus off of employees to be safe at work. Of course, you still can't be drunk or grossly incompetent running around without safety equipment. But it was that kind of, let's just get the lawyers out of it and let's just have this one agency that just pays out. And that was brought in, I think, about 1917. It's been pretty successful since. People have their issues with the Workers' Compensation Board or WorkSafe BC, but largely people hate ICBC a lot more than they hate WorkSafe BC. Some people have had trouble getting what they feel they deserve out of it. But for the most part, if you get injured at work, you'll be taken care of and you'll get back to work, or as much as you can, relatively hassle-free. And I think that's where this shift on ICBC could take us, or ideally will. That doesn't mean it'll be perfect, right?
The devil's always in the details.
Yeah. And people all still struggle with compensation through WorkSafe BC, but there's a good video somewhere in the WorkSafe BC archives about that story. I just found it a fascinating way to stop the back and forth and just focus on the end result, because we don't always need an adversarial system. But the other question I wanted to ask is, did the trial lawyers fight too hard? Was David Eby right that maybe they should have come to the table a little earlier and accepted some limitations that would have maybe helped bring costs down? Because it seems like they fought every single change tooth and nail.
I'm not sure. The court case the trial lawyers won probably would have ended up there anyway. It just would have been someone would have gotten injured and had to sue their way through that. Maybe it would have accelerated things, but given the court's finding, I have a hard time seeing how the cap system was sustainable.
I'm just wondering if maybe there was another point where they could have admitted, all right, our industry doesn't need to run away with money and can be a bit smaller, because it got to a point, it's arguably gotten to a point where it was becoming parasitic and it was just sucking up way too much money. I don't know. I just put it out there. I don't know if it's also an industry association that represents people whose job is to go to court and fight things. So naturally they're going to...
Yeah, it's every problem's a nail when you have a hammer. And I don't know the exact structure of the governance within that profession, but there's also a lot of individual incentives to play as hardball as you can, even if the net effect isn't great for the profession. So it's hard to say.
All right, so next steps, the government intends to consult on this through February, introduce a bill in the legislature in February or March, have it, hopefully, they say, pass the legislature by the end of the spring sitting, have regulations ready by the fall, and this new regime will be in place in May 2021, next spring, which is really fast to overhaul our entire insurance regime, and it's only announced today. So naturally, some people are complaining about lack of consultation.
Also, the timings of NetSpring is interesting with respect to elections.
I guess they don't really have a choice, do they? If
Yeah,
they don't
well, that's
do
the
it by
thing
spring.
is, the longer this drags out, the more time people are going to be paying higher premiums, which is going to be unpopular. And if it isn't in place before the next election, there's a good chance the next election is going to be fought on it. And, well, everything we talked about before is going to come up. And it's going to, in the context of an election, I think it's going to be somewhat hard to play defense on that for the NDP.
Well, and I think the fact that they rolled this out and announced a timeline for it that is by May kind of tells us that they're going to put a lot of political capital into this, and I don't think they'll go to an early election until this is done. That's my feeling. It would seem silly. Anyway, the Greens have... I don't actually understand the Green point of view on this, which is to just, endorse it 100% as soon as it comes out. I guess they were maybe consulted on it before. That's my only guess at why they were very quick to go, yeah, that looks good, we'll do that. I'm not saying the Greens should be ideologically opposed to no-fault insurance. It's just they're not technically in government. So they could oppose it and just say, we'll wait to see the details. We'll probably be coming back to no-fault insurance, or should I say care-based insurance, quite a bit over the spring and fall as this rolls out. And undoubtedly, the people whose job is to sue things will sue this, and we'll see if that goes anywhere. The fact that several provinces have solid no-fault insurance regimes suggests to me that it'll be hard to argue this is unconstitutional on its face.
Moving on to our leadership roundup, starting with the Conservative Party and, well, the train wreck that appears to be Peter MacKay's campaign.
The, runaway train that is heading into a wreck, because he's very far ahead of everyone. He's doing really well, but it's like his train's going off the rails. It's going too fast.
Yeah, so I think it was last week we talked a bit about the French language proficiency issue and how that dogged his campaign right at launch. And a lot of the early social media stuff his campaign's been pumping out has been,
Canada is good and I like hockey.
Yeah, I think the word vapid fails to capture exactly how empty the platitudes were in there. It was bad. It was the thing that someone would make if they'd never seen political communication, but kind of had it described to them one time.
It wasn't offensive to me.
It's not
It was
offensive, it's just really bad.
And not even ugly or anything. It was just vapid seems good.
Yeah, it's a funhouse mirror imitation of what political communication should be. Anyway, it was bad, didn't go very far. And then he decided to play hardball by coming out strongly against Yoda. So
this tweet goes up from his account that criticizes Justin Trudeau for taking $850 of party money.
Yeah, so it was
for yoga training.
During his leadership campaign, his campaign had spent about $800 in Yoda stuff, which I don't know the ins and outs of the Liberal Party's rules around that thing or anything. It's just kind of weird to be making an issue out of another party's leadership race from 7 years ago.
Especially when your own party is still mired in a probably more expensive scandal around private school funding.
Yeah, and you have your own helicopter expense thing.
A lot of weird expenses.
Yeah, anyway, it was a weird play to make that to try and make that a major issue.
Or at least an issue.
Yeah.
A tweet is an issue. And then it turns out, he wasn't actually that proud of that tweet and didn't approve it and wouldn't have approved it. Never had it deleted as far as I know, or at least didn't very quickly. And then it gets weirder as he's in an interview where he gets asked about it and he says at least that much, that he wasn't proud of it and wouldn't have tweeted it. When one of his campaign staffers intervenes and says, this interview's over, you've crossed the line, and Peter MacKay is left going, no, this is a journalist just doing their job, and then they still end the interview, which begs a lot of questions about who's running the campaign, if anyone. Yeah,
it's weird. It turned it into a larger story than it would have otherwise.
And from there, Alex Boutier has a piece in the Toronto Star in the last couple of days that's just titled Inside Peter MacKay's Campaign, Frustration, Confusion, and a Lack of Coherence, where they cite 3 sources who told the Star that the campaign is disorganized and doesn't have a formal structure, and there's frustration growing among the insiders.
So I'm not surprised to hear this. I mean, we talked a bit about the comm stuff at the start of this, and it struck me as a campaign that didn't really have a strategy or anything coherent to even hang the outline of a strategy on. The tweet's still up, by the way.
Okay.
So, being prouder of it or not, it hasn't been deleted yet.
The Star piece goes on to mention a few people who have been considering joining the MacKay campaign, including Nick Kouvalis, who was previously on Rob Ford and John Tory's mayoral campaigns, Julie Vaugh, who's a former Harper spokesperson and chief of staff for Rona Ambrose, and Rachel Curran, who was Harper's policy director and was briefly on the Pierre Poilievre team, but all may keep well away from something that has no clear structure and is struggling. But on the other hand, MacKay's team is claiming that they've raised $500,000 and already have over 3,000 signatures, and so are on the right track to what they need to do. So it's a mess.
Yeah, it seems like he came in there with I'm the front runner, I'm going to run a really safe front runner campaign, but didn't really go to the effort of mapping out what that would be and how to run a safe front runner campaign while still at least saying enough and having enough of a good comm strategy not to appear just weird and incoherent.
And his front-runner status was confirmed by Leger this week in a poll they released on February 1st, where among Conservative voters, 42% picked him as the best choice for a Conservative leader, well ahead of Michelle Rempel-Garner, who was at 6%, and O'Toole, who's actually in the race.
Michelle Rempel, who's not running as of this moment.
And Marilyn Gladu at 2%, and the social conservative Dick Harre, who's at 1%, and another 45% don't know who to vote for. So MacKay is only losing to the don't have an opinion voters. Those aren't Conservative members, to be clear. Not the people actually voting, but...
The way I interpret this poll is that this is largely a case of name recognition at this point. Aaron O'Toole and Michelle Rempel are probably the most well-known people who are also on that list. And I don't think either of them are household names. And Peter MacKay's been in politics for, 25 years at this point?
I mean, he took a break, but...
4 years after being a senior cabinet minister for a decade, it's not a huge break. So it really strikes me as that this is a very soft 42%. That's all about name recognition. And once this actually gets into the campaign and they're doing all the, campaign meet and greets and actually going through there, that'll close up pretty quickly, especially if MacKay keeps bumbling.
Well, one thing that does come to his aid in this Leger poll is they ask Canadians about whether a prime minister and other politicians need to be bilingual. And on leaders of political parties, among all Canadians, 62% said they should be bilingual versus 35% who say it doesn't matter. But among just Conservative voters, it was kind of split down the middle, with 48% wanting a bilingual leader and 50% who aren't as plussed. I'm assuming they presumed the non-bilingual leader would be an Anglophone, for one.
That's probably an assumption they made. But even so, if 50% of your potential voter pool thinks that it should be something a leader should have, that's not a great position to be going into things with, especially when there's probably a regional skew in that one, and a regional skew that goes the wrong way.
Yeah, and it's also worth remembering, if you're bilingual, you can appeal to people who don't care if you are. If you are not, you won't get the people who want a bilingual leader. So,
yeah, that's going to be a lot of electability-focused Conservatives, which, at least my read is, that's something people are placing a lot of emphasis on at the moment.
Well, the other noteworthy sort of element of the Conservative leadership race this week was a couple tweets from Scott Reid, who was throwing shade at an unnamed leadership candidate who was quote, promising nominations to supporters, including in incumbent-held ridings. The implication, says Scott Reid, is sitting MPs who make the wrong leadership choice will later be removed. He calls the tactic highly divisive and having no place in a leadership campaign that should be characterized by civility. So he invites all leadership candidates to disavow this tactic.
Now, most of them did pretty quickly. Turns out the person who is doing this is, I'm not even sure we should bother talking about this because he's such a non-factor in this race, is Aaron Seal, the quote-unquote millennial conservative.
We talked about him before because his video is amazing. Yes.
It was funny, but like getting into the actual race now, it's less so.
Yeah, he retweeted Scott Reid just saying, yes, I'm doing this unapologetically. Love Aaron Seal,
So, like,
leadership candidate.
It's not a good tactic because, yeah, it is hyper divisive, and also removing a sitting MP by preventing them from running for re-election is a pretty big thing to do, and like it's going to cause a lot of problems within the party going into an election, which is never something you want to be doing.
I mean, the balls on him, though, to just like play the grift as loud as he can. He either knows exactly what he's doing, which is just to try to stir up a bunch of noise and controversy, which is why we're talking about him.
Yeah, I'm at this moment, I'm pretty convinced this is a drifting campaign more than anything else.
And I'm all here for it. More of this. In all leaderships, there should be at least like one troll just to make it funny. Like in student body elections at universities for student government, there's always some joke candidates, like someone who puts on a transformer uniform and says, I'm going to transform this campus. It's dumb, but it makes it funnier. So, Aaron Seal, I wouldn't vote for you. Even though he seems like kind of the least, like he's the pot-selling, yoga-instructing guy who's pro-choice. So I probably have more in common with him than many other candidates in the race, but what a fun race.
So, better or worse grifter than Kevin O'Leary, who filled that role last time?
Oh, Kevin O'Leary is more successful at it, though.
Yeah.
Although he dropped out right at the end, so he didn't actually do that well.
And had a bunch of like campaign finance fights with Elections Canada afterwards, I think. So
I think Kevin O'Leary is still like the king of it because he's so much more prominent and went farther than Aaron Seal is going to go, because he's probably not even going to make the minimum threshold for the first round of cuts.
Well, moving on to a campaign that so far is lacking drifting, or a announced drifter.
Or many candidates. Right now, the only candidate for the leadership of the BC Greens is what we're talking about, is Sonia Furstenau. And she got a slight boost possibly this week, depending on your opinion, from an endorsement from Lisa Helps, the mayor of Victoria. Mayors don't tend to weigh in like this into provincial politics, in my experience. And Helps notes that this is, quote, a non-partisan endorsement as a non-member.
That's threading a very fine needle there.
Like, it's not illegal. Mm-hmm. It's just weird. The Greens do note, and Furstenau notes in her press release, that the Green Party is opening the leadership to non-members under a new supporter class. So I think maybe the hope is that Helps can bring along some of the support she has in Victoria from progressive circles. Like, we're not going to see Kennedy Stewart endorsing people.
Well, that's the wrong party for one thing.
That's a bigger issue. But maybe it'll help Furstenau pick up a few votes in the capital region.
Yeah, although right now she's running unopposed, and Joanna Campbell, former candidate for New West, was also former deputy leader and is now actually back in that role after the interim leaders took over. It's complicated. Small caucuses are super fun. She decided she's not running.
Yeah, her name had been tossed around a few times as a potential candidate and as a potentially strong candidate. She's got name recognition in green circles in Metro Vancouver. New West is a hard seat to break through for anyone who's not the NDP, but there was some thought that that might be where the Greens could land on the mainland. She says it's for personal and family reasons. Understandable. It takes a lot to be a leader of a political party, but that still leaves it as a very small race. Now, I have heard rumors there's one or more serious candidates considering or planning to throw their names in. We have patrons who are teasing us with that, but not saying who it is. Not that we'd leak anything our patrons tell us. So keep your eye on the race, I guess. And hopefully there will be more of a race coming up.
Yeah, wins by default are no fun to watch.
Although that's how Horgan became premier. And it wasn't a fun leadership, it was boring.
Yeah, exactly, that's my point. We want something fun.
Well, let's move on to quick takes. First up, mixing the provincial and federal jurisdiction. Well, actually, it's purely federal, as the Supreme Court recently decided. Trans Mountain has won another round of court cases as the Federal Court of Appeal ruled that the latest round of consultations was reasonable and sufficient.
And did so in a pretty definitive manner, too.
Yeah, so the court ruled unanimously and did it by the bench, so it was unsigned, meaning all the justices who heard the case agreed and decided that they want to write it together in as strong a words as possible. The government did enough consultations. So this was the follow-up review after the Federal Court of Appeal a couple of years ago threw it back for more consultations.
So the decision notes that this is the end result. That was not the end result of a ratification of an earlier approval, but an approval with amended conditions flowing directly from the renewed consultation. So they basically looked at and said, yeah, we can see you've actually made changes based on what you've heard during consultations. And later on, they go to say that, well, there's a requirement to consult that does not predetermine any outcome and that it does not amount to a veto. So we're going ahead and saying, yeah, you've consulted, you've taken what was said into account, and we're going to say, yep, that meets the requirements of the law, no injunction. In about as strong of words as judges say that sort of thing in.
Yeah, it's probably the last possible barrier in the way, at least legal, for the Trans Mountain expansion to continue. I mean, it is working and building it right now. But
yeah, almost certainly this will get appealed. Whether or not the Supreme Court decides to grant leave to hear it's the bigger question, but
it seems unlikely to me
that it'll get appealed or that they'll hear it.
That they'll hear it.
Yeah,
I'm sure it'll get appealed.
Oh yeah, with something this contentious, there will be a group funding the appeal for sure.
But yeah, beyond this, it sounds like protests and civil disobedience is probably the last meaningful way for people opposed to the pipeline to try to oppose it, and even then,
I mean, it's almost certainly going to go through at this point, which it feels like a fairly foregone conclusion, which does make me kind of wonder from how to accelerate the changes away from fossil fuels, whether putting so much effort into trying to stop this pipeline was the best use of those resources, and what was the opportunity cost of trying to advance other policies that would say more take aim at it from we're going to make it less necessary to use fossil fuels by having alternatives and advancing them quicker.
I think it's immeasurable from the nonprofit and activist point of view, because the entire fight has raised awareness around the question, and that's hard to actually put a value sign. Like, they may have lost the battle, but could still see it as part of a broader war. So the war on Trans Mountain can now shift to be our next story, the tech giant extraction mine they want to put in the oil sands.
Now, this is not something that's going to be extracting oil from Google, right? Different tech giant.
Yes, this is TECK. They have a giant project before Cabinet right now who have to decide whether to permit this project to go ahead, which could theoretically create 7,000 jobs, pump out hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil a day. Hell, it will fill the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline kind of situation. Alberta is like, if you don't approve this, it's just proof how much you hate us. But notably, several Liberal MPs are actually speaking out publicly that they think this is a terrible project that will be impossible to square with the party's commitment to go to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And it's not just Nathaniel Erskine Smith who always speaks out against the Liberals.
Well, sometimes.
Most often.
We should, yeah. This is Canada. The radical mavericks only vote with their party, 98.5% of the time, which is disappointing. But that's the system we've got.
So in addition to Erskine Smith, Pontiac MP Will Almos, who's the Parliamentary Secretary for Science, is also somewhat opposed to the project, saying he doesn't think it can be squared with their commitments to the climate targets. Pickering Uxbridge MP Jennifer O'Connell calls the environment one of the biggest issues in her riding, and she's just not sure that this can work. And Liberal MP John MacKay is kind of on the fence about it, He says, I'm at 6s and 7s. I haven't come around to it. A number of others weren't wanting to comment publicly, but are talking to their constituents. And so it seems like a real uncertainty among the Liberal caucus. And it's just interesting to see MPs speaking up publicly about this, whereas on Trans Mountain, the government kind of made its decision. And even before it had made its decision, MPs weren't really questioning the pipeline.
Yeah. Now, this isn't going to go to a vote on the floor of the House of Commons because these are the sorts of decisions that get made at the cabinet level. But it is noteworthy nonetheless that MPs are doing the rare thing of criticizing their own party over something.
Or at least taking a position when their party hasn't. Speaking freely, which is good to see. It's hard to see how you can square a project that will produce 4.1 million tons of carbon dioxide a year while also still trying to get us to net zero. I mean,
it puts the Liberals in a bit of a tough position because they've really, since the election, tried to take much more of we're going to be the party that's trying to kind of rebuild national unity sort of thing. And Alberta very much sees this as a question in that vein.
The funny element of this as well is that Teck is even on the fence about whether they proceed with the project because oil prices might not be high enough to make it viable.
Yeah. And that's actually something that's pretty interesting. Like, I remember 15 years ago, there was, whenever peat oil would come up, it was always in the context of peat oil supply. Like, there was going to be a limit on how much oil we could extract, and that was going to be the thing that kind of caused the big problems. You don't really actually hear that much anymore. It's always about, like, and when we do talk about peat oil, it's always peat oil demand. And it's always hard to prognosticate on stuff that happens a decade or two out, but there's a decent chance that there's maybe one last boom for oil, if that, before it loses its economic place.
Like, the biggest thing working against Alberta right now is the oil it has is expensive, hard to produce, hard to ship, hard to do anything with, and so it's kind of a bad product no one really wants. Like, Saudi Arabia has...
Yeah, Trans Mountain takes care of one of those problems.
Yeah.
That.
It doesn't let it be produced any easier because you still have to get the massive amount of dirt out of the bitumen to get the black gold that you want. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, has enough oil that they can keep oil prices at whatever price they want because they run all their mines. And if you keep oil prices below $100 a barrel, which they've been for quite a while, it's really hard to make the oil sands viable.
Yeah, I think the break-even point's close to like 65, 70. But like, yeah.
And we've been sitting around 40 or 50. Mm-hmm. And guess what? Jason Kenney doesn't have a solution to that problem. But neither did Rachel Notley. So Alberta's just screwed.
The global commodities are not controlled from the Premier's desk in Alberta.
I mean, I'll give credit Rachel Notley's decision to fix the amount of supply that could be released from Alberta. I think was probably the only thing she could do. Like, if you're fighting other countries that are playing with the supply nozzles, doing it on your own supply is the only way I think you can reasonably stop your price from crashing. But too little, too late. Anyway, we'll have to see later this month when the cabinet eventually meets to decide the fate of this project, and then whether it goes ahead anyway.
And finally, we're going to finish off on a bit of a sad note as Peter Hogg, the constitutional scholar, passed away this week. Yeah,
he was 80 years old. Hogg probably isn't a household name, but every lawyer in Canada probably knows his name. His book, Constitutional Law of Canada, was cited more times than anything by Supreme Court of Canada justices over the years because he's was single-handedly the person who knew most about how our country works and had gone over everything. And, when you wanted an opinion on how Canadian law works or government wanted that, they would call Peter Hogg because he would know. He ended his career as Dean Emeritus and Professor Emeritus at Osgoode Law School from University of Toronto. All around, widely respected. 80 years is a respectable life, and he did a lot with it, so sad day.
Indeed. And that has been Politicos. Find links to everything we talked about at politicos.ca. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/politicos. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Saoirse Potnikoff. Politicos is a production of Leg and Boot Media. and editing services are provided by Cortado Productions. Thanks for listening.